The Tarot and Magic. Magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with the will. In other words, it is science, pure and applied. This thesis has been worked out at great length by Dr. Sir J. G. Fraser, but in common parlance, the word magic has been used to mean the kind of science which ordinary people do not understand. It is in this restricted sense, for the most part, that the word will be used in this essay. The business of science is to explore nature. Its first questions are, what is this? How did it come to be? What are its relations to any other object? The knowledge acquired may then be used in applied science, which asks, how can we best employ such and such a thing or idea for the purpose that to us seems fit? An example may make this clear. The Greeks of old were aware that by rubbing amber, which they called electron, upon silk, the amber acquired the power of attracting itself light objects such as small pieces of paper. But there they stopped. Their science was hoodwinked by theological and philosophical theories of the a priori type. So that's the second time he said a priori, and I'm not really sure what it means, so I might as well look it up here. A priori means relating to or denoting reasoning or knowledge which proceeds from theoretical deduction rather than from observation or experience. Gotcha. Makes perfect sense. Non-scientific reasoning. Rather than from observation. Oh, sorry. Oppositely. It's the opposite. Using reason rather than personal subjective experience. Good. Their science was hoodwinked by theological and philosophical theories of the a priori type. So I guess they were going through convoluted, reasoning rather than just using their better judgment, is what he's saying. It was well over 2,000 years before this phenomenon was correlated with the other electrical phenomena. The idea of measurement was hardly known to anyone but mathematicians like Archimedes and astronomers. The foundations of science, as it is understood today, were hardly laid at all 200 years ago. There was an immense amount of knowledge, but it was nearly all qualitative. The classification of phenomena depended chiefly upon poetic analogies. The doctrines of correspondences and signatures were based upon fanciful resemblances. Cornelius Agrippa wrote of the antipathy between a dolphin and a whirlpool. If a meretrix sat under an olive tree, it would bear no more fruit. Don't know what I just read. If anything looked like something else, it partook in some mysterious way of its qualities. This sounds today to many people mere superstitious ignorance and nonsense, but it is not altogether so. The old system of classification was sometimes good and sometimes bad, as far as it went, but in no case did it go very far. The natural ingenuity of their natural philosophers did compensate very largely for the weakness of their theory, and it did ultimately lead them, especially through alchemy, where they were forced by the nature of the work to add real to their ideal observation, to introduce the idea of measure. Modern science, intoxicated by the practical success which attended this innovation, has simply shut the door on anything that cannot be measured. The old guard refuses to discuss it, but the loss is immense. Obsession with strictly physical qualities has blocked out all real human values. Excuse me. I didn't go to that school. The science of the tarot is entirely based upon this older system. The calculations involved are very precise, but they never lose sight of the incommensurable and the imponderable. The theory of animism was always present in the minds of the medieval masters. Any natural object possessed not only its material characteristics, but was a manifestation of a more or less tangible idea on which it depended. The pool was a pool, true, but also there was a nymph whose home it was. In her turn, she was dependent on a superior kind of nymph, who was much less closely attached to any given pool, but more to pools in general, and so on, up to the supreme Lady of Water, who exercised a general supervision over her whole dominion. She, of course, was subject to the general ruler of all the four elements. It was exactly the same idea as in the case of the police constable, who had his sergeant, inspector, superintendent, commissioner, always getting more cloudy and remote until you reach the shadowy Home Secretary, who is himself the servant of a completely intangible and incalculable phantom called the will of the people. We may doubt how far the personification of these entities was conceived as real by the ancients, but the theory was that while anyone with a pair of eyes could see the pool, he could not see the nymph except by some accident, but they thought that a superior type of person, by dint of searching, study, and experiment, might acquire this general power. A person still more advanced in this science could get into real connection with the superior because subtler forms of life. With the superior because subtler forms of life. A person still more advanced in the science could get into real connection with the superior because subtler forms of life. Okay. He could perhaps cause them to manifest themselves to him in material shape. A good deal of this rests upon the Platonic ideology, which maintained that any material object was an impure and imperfect copy of some ideal perfection. So men who wished to advance in spiritual science and philosophy strove always to formulate for themselves the pure idea. They tried to proceed from the particular to the general, and this principle has been the greatest service to ordinary science. The mathematics of 6 plus 5 equals 11, and 12 plus 3 equals 15 was all in bits. Advance only came when they wrote down their equations in general terms. X squared y squared equals x plus y and x minus y. Covers all possible cases of subtracting the square of one number from the square of another. So the meaningless and abstract, when understood, has far more meaning than the intelligible and concrete. These considerations apply to the cards taken from the tarot. What is the meaning of the Five of Wands? This card is subject to the Lord of Fire because it is a wand. Right. And to the Sephra Geburah because it is a 5. Let's just take a look at the tree. Here's 5. It's called Geburah. You can see it's fiery and red. It has Mars attributed to it. It's called Strength. Of course, I lost my place immediately. Geburah because it's a 5. It is also subject to the sign Leo and to the planet Saturn. 5. Leo is the 5th sign. Leo is a 5. And it's attributed to the planet Saturn because of its oppositional kind of position in the scheme of everything. It's a balancing force or an oppositional force to mercy, 4. Because this planet and sign determine the nature of the card. This is no more than saying that a dry martini has got some juniper in it and some alcohol and some white wine and herbs. It's a bit of a lemon peel and some ice. It is a harmonious composition of various elements. Once mixed, it forms a single compound from which it would be very difficult to separate the ingredients, yet each element is necessary to the composition. Don't you get it, guys? So it's got lots of influences. Kind of makes a little dry martini that is specifically the Five of Wands because of that very specific mix of influences and identities, which makes it special. It's the same. The same goes for the Sephirot. Some are more pure, some are more diluted, you could say, but they're unique in their kind of mix of powers. Now, these add their influences to these cards that he's talking about, and these get a more kind of diverse mix of influences, making them probably a little harder to understand, something like a tarot card as opposed to a Sephirot. The Five of Wands is therefore a personality. The nature of this is summed up in the tarot by calling it strife. This means that if used passively in divination, one says when it turns up, there's going to be a fight. If used actively, I just yelled that, it means that the proper course of conduct is to contend. But there is a further point about this card. If governed from the angelic world by two beings, one during the hours of light and other during the hours of darkness. Therefore, in order to use the properties of this card, one way is to get into communication with the intelligence concerned, and to induce him to execute his function. There are thus 72 angels set over the 36 small cards. These are derived from the great name of God of the 72 letters called Shem Ham Forash. All right, now he's getting into some deep Kabbalah shit. Talking about angels. So these angels essentially manage the intelligences, quote unquote, of the card, or they govern them, I should say. He says they're governed by in the angelic world by beings, each card by two beings, one light and one dark, one during the hours of light during the daytime and one during the hours of darkness. So two angels to each arcana in the tarot. Sorry, minor arcana. So over each minor card, there's two, makes up 72 angels. Interesting. Called the Shem Ham Forash. Let's get into it. The Shem Ham Forash and the tarot. This word means the divided name. The name is Tetragrammaton, Yud, He, Vav, He, or IHVH, commonly called Jehovah. He is the supreme lord of the four elements which compose fundamentally the whole universe. There are 3 verses in Exodus, chapter 14, verses 19, 20, and 21, each containing 72 letters. By writing down the first of these, and underneath this the next verse backwards, as under this again the last verse forwards, 72 columns of 3 letters are obtained. Okay? These are read downwards, and the terminations al or a, according as they are male or female, appended. Gotcha. There is also an attribution of these intelligences, one to each of the quinaries or segments of 5 degrees of the zodiac. But there are also innumerable other angels, demons, magical images, lords of triplicities, lesser assistant angels, and so on, with demons to correspond. It is quite useless to study all these attributions. They could only be wanted in case of wishing to get into actual communication with one of these or some special purpose. So basically, this information is really good for like actual magical practices rather than standard tarot divination. These matters are here mentioned for the sake of completeness, but the tarot will lose all its vitality for one who allows himself to be sidetracked by its pedantry. That's something I think I have to look up as well. Excessive concern with minor details and rules. Gotcha. Yep. The tarot and ceremonial magic. The tarot is, thus, intimately bound up with the purely magical arts of invocation and evocation. By invocation is meant the aspiration to the highest, the purest form of the part of oneself that one wishes to put into action. Evocation is much more objective. It does not imply perfect sympathy. One's attitudes to the being evoked may even be at least superficially hostile. Then, of course, the further advanced one is in initiation, the less the idea of hostility enters one's mind. Then, of course, the further advanced one is in initiation, the less the idea of hostility enters one's mind. To comprendre, I can't actually speak French. To comprendre, c'est to pardonner. Thus, in order to understand any given card, one must identify oneself with it completely for the moment. And one way of doing this is to induce or compel the intelligence ruling the card to manifest to the senses. Like he said, there's one for the day and one for the night. For, as explained above, the ancient theory of the universe included the thesis that every object in nature possessed a spiritual guardian. Roughly speaking, this did not apply so much to the manufactured objects, though there are exceptions to this, as in the case of the gods of the hearth, the lintel, and the like, or of angels or spirits as supposed to be interested in one's sword or one's spear. A particularly powerful weapon was likely to get the reputation of not having been manufactured at all by human hands, but forged in volcanoes or in fairyland, and thus imbued with preternatural powers. Preternatural, another word I have to look up. Beyond what is normal or natural, okay, but not supernatural, I guess. Good. Thank you. Where were we? Right. A particularly powerful weapon, right. Thus imbued with preternatural powers. Some famous swords had names and were regarded as living beings. They were liable to fly out of the window if the owner played about too much instead of killing people as is proper. The tarot and animism. It is only natural, therefore, that at a time when pictorial or written representations of ideas were beyond the comprehension of any but a very few people, when writing itself was considered magical and printing, as it is, an invention of the devil, people should regard hieroglyphs, whether written or pictured, as living things having power in themselves. It may be that, even today, there are houses in darkest Shropshire, where anyone who put another book on top of the family Bible would be told never to darken those doors again. Automatic action is everywhere ascribed to inanimate objects. For instance, horseshoes on doors. That's funny. I feel like both of those superstitions applied in my house. Well, we definitely had rules about books where they can be sat down, and I had a horseshoe on my closet door when I was a kid, but maybe because it was a cowboy wallpaper too. I don't know. There is an entire class of such superstitions. The problem of how any given superstition arose has not always been satisfactorily solved. one can ignorantly derive the sitting down 13 at table nonsense from the legend of the Last Supper. Incidentally, it can hardly have been the first time that those 13 sat down to table. Okay, I'm just looking at this strange statement he made about the Last Supper. I don't know. I'm not Catholic. I don't really understand. But the really primitive superstitions cannot be explained so simply. It seems more probable that they arose from the unscientific habit, extremely common among men of science, of generalizing from too few facts. It might happen by chance that on half a dozen occasions within a short period, a hunter setting out at full moon was killed. The old fallacy of post hoc prompter hoc would come in, and the village would say, "It is unlucky to go out hunting at full moon." This would gather force as it was repeated through the generations. By virtue of mental indolence, it would not be disturbed because taboo would render the original coincidence unlikely to recur. If, however, something similar came off at the new moon, there would be a new superstition, and presently there would be a complete nexus of taboo about the moon. A recent case of the late Mr. S. L. Mathers, published in 1898 to 99, the translation of a manuscript called The Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage in a small private edition. Some hundreds of people bought it. One special group of purchasers under his personal observation were all or nearly all hit by misfortune. Within a year, people were saying it was terribly dangerous to have the book on one's shelves. Would this theory have resisted statistical examination? Who can say? But curiously enough, in 1938, a neglected copy was taken from its hiding place on an obscure shelf. Immediately, disasters occurred to most of the people concerned, and to those whom they were in close relationship. Post hoc prompter hoc. But who can be sure? The cards of the tarot as living beings. Victorian science, flushed with its victory over supernaturalism, was quite right to declare the immeasurable out of bounds. It had a right to do so on technical grounds, and it was a strategical necessity of its offensive. But it hampered itself by limiting its scope. It laid itself open to the deadliest attacks from philosophy, then especially from the angle of mathematical physics. Its own generals betrayed its dogmatism. The essence of science today is far more mysterious than the cloudiest speculations of Leibniz, Spinoza, or Hegel. The modern definition of matter reminds one irresistibly of the definition of spirit given by such mystics as Ruysbrock, Bohm, and Molinos. The idea of the universe in the mind of a modern mathematician is singularly reminiscent of the ravings of William Blake. But the mystics were all wrong when they were pious, and held that their mysteries were too sacred to analyze. They ought to have brought in the idea of measure. This is exactly what was done by the magicians and Kabbalists. The difficulty has been that the units of measurement have themselves been somewhat elastic. They even tend to be literary. Their definitions were as circular as, but not more fugitive than, the definitions of the physicists today. Their methods were empirical, though they strove to make them accurate, as well as lack of precise measures and standard apparatus permitted, because they had not yet formulated any true scientific theory. But their successes were all numerous, and depended on individual skill. One would rather trust oneself in illness to the born physician than to the laboratory experts of Battle Creek. One would rather trust oneself in illness than the born physician. One of the great differences between the ancient and modern chemistry is the idea of the alchemists that substance in its natural state is, in some other way or other, a living thing. The modern tendency is to insist on the measurable. One can go into a museum and see rows of glass globes and bottles which contain the chemical substances which go to make up the human body, but the collection is very far from being a man. Still less does it explain the difference between Lord Tom Noddy and Bill Sykes. 19th century chemists were at great pains to analyze opium and isolate its alkaloids, rather like a child pulling a watch to pieces to see what makes it go. They succeeded, but the results were not altogether wholesome. Morphine has much more direct hypnotic effects than opium. Its action is speedier and more violent. It is also a very dangerous drug, and its effects are often disastrous. The action of morphine is sensibly modified by the other 20-odd alkaloids which exist in opium. The intoxicating effect of alcohol differs according to whether one absorbs it in Reichsborg 29 or in synthetic gin. An even more startling example comes from Venezuela, where running messengers chew cocoa leaves, cover their 100 miles a day, and sleep till they are rested. They have no bad reaction, and they do not acquire the habit. Cocaine is a different story. The adepts of the tarot would say quite simply, we are alive and the plant is alive, so we can make friends, and if you kill the plant first, you are asking for trouble. All this here written in defense of the system of the makers and users of the tarot, and of their methods of dealing with nature, of making experiments without undue attention to the wish to get things done quickly. They would expose a mixture to the rays of the sun or moon for weeks or months, thinking that everything would be spoilt if they boiled it up violently. The processes of nature, they would say, are slow and temperate. Let us copy them. There may have been good grounds for these views. Experience leads to that conclusion, this by way of introduction to a thesis most necessary to the understanding of the tarot. Each card is, in a sense, a living being, and its relations with its neighbors are what one might call diplomatic. It is for the student to build these living stones into his living temple. Good, we finished part 1. And part 2 covers the cards themselves, very specifically. So you'll see it'll go more in depth into the Fool, I believe, than other cards. Just going to kind of scroll through to get an idea, talking about the Fool, the Fool, the Fool. There's lots of stuff to see here. But this is essentially a different book. Its format is quite different. And here he starts talking about the juggler or the magician. And yeah, you can see he has a little less to say on those, on the rest of the cards. Let's see here. Okay. We're far back. Well, I think I can cut the video there, and we can begin part 2 in the next section, even though that makes this video, I don't know, just a little shorter than the rest of them, but that's fine. We'll begin part 2 in the next video, or maybe after I read from a different book, because this might be a good opportunity to jump over to something else, read some other material, something short maybe, and then we can return to part 2 of this book, talk about the tarot cards. I can pull out my cards, maybe even pick up a Crowley deck so we can get more in depth with it. I thank you, everybody, for watching the 6 parts of this series. For me to just read part 1 of Crowley's book, the Book of Thoth, his wonderful syncretism syncretism of Kabbalah and tarot. Thanks again for watching.